Good evening. Well, this is rare. We're starting exactly on time, not Broadway, 6 o'clock. And that's because wherever Sam Schwartz goes, there's a full house. And they're in place, and he wants to move New York, move us in, move us out, and I'm going to respect that. I'm Harold Holzer, director of the Roosevelt House, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here. As I know most of you know, this is the New York City home that Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt shared with his mother for 25 years, beginning in 1908. This was one of the great wedding presents of American history, half of a double townhouse, and it came with a caveat, and that is the mother-in-law who built it lived in the house with her son and daughter-in-law for the next 25 years. It was the great good fortune of Roosevelt House, and I'm telling this story a slightly different way for those of you who have heard me do this for 2.5 years. One of the great good fortunes for Hunter College that Eleanor at times felt so unwelcome in this, her own home, that she migrated a few blocks over to the Hunter College Library, where she met Hunter students, mentored them, befriended them, brought them back here to make grilled cheese sandwiches for them. And over the years, Hunter became an important place in her life. And when Sarah Roosevelt died in 1941, and FDR banished the thought of ever returning to this place without his mom being here and put it up for sale, it was Eleanor who called the president of Hunter and arranged this wonderful discounted sale. God forbid Hunter should pay $70,000 for this house when it could get it for $60,000. So the great discounted real estate transaction of the century, and we're grateful every minute for that transactional experience between Eleanor and the school that now runs this great place. This has been a transformative day for us here, and it will continue tomorrow. We had Senator Dick Durbin here this morning to speak to students in the DACA program, our dreamers at Hunter, who are so threatened, feel so threatened about their status, which is expiring in March. He gave them great hope that there is still a way to do legislation in this country. We hope he can do it as well as he described it. Tomorrow we have Natan Sharansky, one of the great dissidents of world history, and in between we have Sam Schwartz. So nothing but champions, nothing but the best in their field. As we know, as we think about the subject that Sam is going to address today, that FDR, in his tenure during the early days and middle days of the New Deal, built or improved 651,000 miles of roads across this country and constructed 1,200 airports. All these projects initiated in the 1930s, and we don't usually think about transportation projects with Roosevelt, but he is the one who famously put a system of highways on a grid above a map of the country and convinced Congress to begin paying for the 40,000-mile national interstate system, for which Eisenhower ultimately got credit because he was there to cut most of the ribbons. But apparently when the network is finished, I'm told, Sam will confirm or deny, it bore uncanny resemblance to the first grid that FDR set upon that map of the United States. When you think about presidents who understood the importance of the transportation network, we can't help thinking but the great inspiration for the program that we celebrate today, because Theodore Kiel, who I was honored enough to know when he was a negotiator for the Christo and Jean-Claude project, The Gates, and I was at the Metropolitan Museum. Boy, was he a tough negotiator, even at that point. He was an advisor to several presidents on transportation, the first of whom was Franklin D. Roosevelt when Ted Keel was a rising young lawyer. What an extraordinary connection to make. And Ted Keel, who focused on such a wide array of issues during his long and extremely influential career, saw this fundamental conflict early between development and environmental concerns, which led him to found the Institute for Sustainable Cities that we're very proud to say still resides at Hunter College under the leadership of Professor Justin Garson, who is organizing a program on sustainability ethics for the spring here at Roosevelt House. We also know that Ted Keel went on to found the Nurture Nature Foundation to promote environmentally sensitive development. Today it's led by his children, Robert Keel and Jane Keel Stanley, who we're so honored to say is here today and whom we thank. They have followed in Ted Keel's enormous footsteps, and they build upon this milestone work every day as lawyers and defenders of the environment as well. So we're grateful indeed to the Keel family because they created the extraordinary program and opportunity that we made available for the first time this spring, the Theodore Keel Fellowship in Urban Transportation, because of their generosity and interest in promoting a sustainable transportation development. They helped us create this program. Their generosity made it possible, and their diligence and high standards made it obvious that the choice for the inaugural Ted Keel Fellow was Gridlock Sam himself. And he has just finished a semester mentoring, inspiring, and teaching terrific students. Some of them went on to work for Ted Keel's company, and you know he has high standards, so that was the biggest honor that we could have, that he retained some of them along the way. We're going to continue the program this spring, and Sam is a hard act to follow. We're glad that he's here to talk about yet another issue in his continuing role until January 3rd as the inaugural Ted Keel Fellow. And what better moment to have Gridlock Sam here than on a day when hundreds of people jumped out of their cars on the Grand Central Parkway because they were so ensnared in post-holiday traffic that they fled, ran across the parkway to LaGuardia. It's happened before, but it hasn't happened for a while, and some of us had hoped the worst was over. I wonder if they were saying, where was Gridlock Sam with the advice I need? He didn't mention this. He mentioned a lot of things in his column last week, including Hunter. Well, anyway, Sam is president and CEO when he's not the Keel Fellow of Sam Schwartz Engineering. As most of you know, a columnist for the Daily News and other papers. His most recent book, some copies of which we'll have available at the reception upstairs after the program, is Street Smart: The Rise of Cities and the Fall of Cars. He was legendarily the New York City Traffic Commissioner and the Chief Engineer of the New York City Department of Transportation. And now working with the son of my old boss to show how the family traditions work for Governor Andrew Cuomo on congestion pricing and the prospect of resuscitating that long dormant but much needed, certainly for discussion, program for New York City. It's always a pleasure to welcome Sam to Roosevelt House. Please welcome him tonight.
Thank you, Harold, for that introduction. And for me, the past year has been an incredible honor being the first Keel Fellow. And one of the quotes that I've learned during this time period about Ted Keel was, A, what a civil rights leader he was, but he also saw transportation as a civil rights issue. And keep that in mind as I discuss this, because there is a lot of inequality in our city and how people get around. And part of this is about the inequality and trying to change the playing field. I know a couple of people here from Community Services Society that just put out an incredible paper on inequality in transportation and how congestion pricing could really alter that equation. You've probably been following some of the articles in the newspapers over the past few months. On August 14th, there was an incredible announcement. I remember the date well because my granddaughter was born on that date. But there was something else significant that happened on that day, and that is when Andrew Cuomo said, congestion pricing, the time has come. And so he then, over the next couple of months, formed a panel. I was kind of shocked to be selected for that panel because I've always been on the outside of those panels. I can't tell you how many transportation panels have been formed in the 50 years or so that I've been involved in transportation in New York City, and I've never been asked to be on a transportation panel. So something was up that he was doing that. The panel will come up with its recommendations at the end of December, and it will not be precisely the Move New York plan, but you may recognize some of the things that I'm going to show you today. I will show you the pure Move New York plan that really kept this debate going through this period. If we had this talk back in June or July, it looked like there was no chance this legislative season or any legislative season coming up. And now we're very much alive. And now many people are discussing congestion pricing, some form of Move New York as we go forward. The other part is that Ted Keel funded a lot of the work through his foundation, and Jane and Bob helped fund the work of Charles Kamenoff that did a great deal of this research that you'll see. So many of the analysis here, many of the numbers that you'll see come from that work that Charles Kamenoff did. So Move New York, fastest, safer, fair, and I have the quote by Albert Einstein, and Harold said he didn't know that Albert Einstein supported congestion pricing. My brother is over here, Brian, a physicist, not quite a contemporary of Albert Einstein, but he tells me Einstein would have supported it had he been asked at the time. So, and the reason I put that quote up there is that we've tried this many, many times, and I'm probably the only person who's been around for all the failures. So you can hold me responsible, but I've learned something over that time. This is an unusual time in which traffic is at its worst ever. Traffic has dropped from a terrible speed of 6.5 miles an hour. By the way, when I was traffic commissioner, it was 9.5 miles an hour. We were giving speeding tickets when people hit double digits in those days. But it dropped to 6.5 miles an hour 5 years ago, and now it's at a devastatingly slow pace of 4.7 miles an hour. And we've never seen anything like this. I've looked at data going back to 1915. People were moving faster than this for 100 years. Now, why is this important right now? It's because as I've made the rounds, and I have made the rounds over many, many years, talking to lots of people, and I've spent most of the time with opponents to congestion pricing, because what's the point of talking to people that are already converted? And most of those people are drivers, and they have what I call a windshield view of the world. And many of them are our elected officials. And they are traveling in cars with parking permits, and they're able to park anywhere that they want. All of a sudden, in the past 6 months or so, the traffic has gotten so bad that even the windshield crowd is beginning to come around and saying something has got to be done. So the crisis that you're reading about underground, that you may be living with underground or on city buses, it has also now spilled over to the car crowd. And so suddenly there are people saying we need relief. In terms of the subways, I think everybody knows what has happened here. You could see just in 2010 a near 90% on-time performance, which still would put us just about last in the world. And now we're down to 66.8% on-time performance, and it's dropping. So this is pretty awful. I do hope things get better. A couple of good appointments by the governor. I think that we have a new chief that's going to improve the subways, but it's going to take time and it's going to take some money. Now, the other reason that people are paying attention is that we're a competitive city and we're losing our edge. We're not even close now to where some other cities are, where London is with its transportation, with its programs, and some other cities around the world. And London has had congestion pricing since 2003. And while I was really happy when it was introduced in London, I must tell you, there were pangs of jealousy because I thought New York City should be first in the Western world. Singapore had done it in 1975. And the reason I felt New York should be first is not only do we deserve it, but it was invented here by William Vickery, a Columbia University professor of economics, who went on to win the Nobel Prize in economics in 1996. But he used to show up at meetings when I was a city official and pester me all the time to implement congestion pricing. And I always felt that New York should have followed suit. I tried my best over the years, but unfortunately we didn't succeed. If you go to London, you'll see transit projects galore. Crossrail is just one of many of them that are happening, and they're passing us in so many ways, as are many other cities. New York City doesn't have congestion pricing, or do we? Actually, we do. The borough of Staten Island has congestion pricing. You must pay a toll to get into the borough of Staten Island. I always imagined that if there was a group from Mars and we were visiting Earth and we knew New York City was the hottest city on the planet and we wanted to go to the hottest spot in the hottest city, and we look through our telescopes and we see everybody is lined up to get into Staten Island, long lines of cars. That's got to be the hot spot. Take me to Staten Island. Well, we have it in Staten Island, and you know what? We've had it for 50, 60 years, 70 years, actually probably closer to 90 years now, with the opening of the George Washington Bridge, across the Hudson River. Everybody from New Jersey has to pay. Everybody has to pay, and there's congestion charge during the peak hours for people from New Jersey. But we act as if this is so foreign. How can we do it here in New York City? Now, we have had tolls on our bridges. People say the East River bridges are free. I hate that term, free. Somebody pays for it. And you know what? For years, we didn't pay for it. And in the 1980s, I was the bridge chief, among other things, the chief engineer for the city of New York. And I had to close most of the Manhattan Bridge, parts of the Queensboro Bridge, the entire Williamsburg Bridge, and the Brooklyn Bridge. We had to close a couple of lanes, and the walkway as well. They are not free. When we stopped paying for them, we made a near fatal mistake in losing our bridges. In 1883, when the Brooklyn Bridge opened, we charged a toll. In 1903, when the Williamsburg Bridge opened, we charged a toll. 1909, the Queensboro opened, now the Ed Koch Bridge, and the Manhattan Bridge opened, and we charged a toll. And we charged up to 10 cents for one of those newfangled vehicles, one of those motor vehicles. If you were on a horse, it was 3 cents. Pedestrians were a penny. But Mayor William Gaynor, who came from Brooklyn, where I come from, decided that we had to unify the city, and he removed the tolls on the bridge. And at that time, we actually respected Public Works, so we didn't have a problem maintaining it. He shifted money from elsewhere, but by the 1950s, 1960s, we forgot how to maintain things. We let things collapse. The West Side Highway collapsed. The parts of the Brooklyn Bridge collapsed. 2 cables snapped in 1981, killing a Brooklyn dentist, killing a Japanese photographer. In 1989, the elevated portion of the FDR Drive collapsed at 20th Street, killing a Brooklyn dentist. In the metro area, 15 people died in the 1980s in bridge collapses. We had forgotten how to take care of how to do basic maintenance, and we're forgetting again. 25 years later, for decades, we did take care of the bridges because we had that horrible decade, and I had a role in setting a program going forward, but now we're forgetting to do the basic maintenance when it comes to roads and bridges. When you do pay a toll on a bridge within New York City, or a tunnel within New York City, it is a Robert Moses-built bridge or tunnel. And they're still there. The tolls are still there. The tolls from the first bridge in the 1930s, the Triborough Bridge, to the Verrazano Bridge in the 60s, every bridge he built, every tunnel he built, you still pay a toll there. And then Nelson Rockefeller comes along in 1968, and he comes up with this great idea to create the MTA. And he said to Bob Moses, we're going to create this wonderful organization. It's going to include the railroads, the Long Island Railroad, the Metro-North, different names then. We're going to have subways, the buses, and oh yeah, your bridges and tunnels, and you'll be in charge of it all. And Moses, I guess he was about 80 years old at the time, and I shouldn't say anything about that as I'm approaching certain ages, but somehow he fell for it. And Rockefeller appointed Bill Ronan as the MTA chief, and that's when Moses really began to fade away from public service, and he no longer had much of a role going forward. So what Nelson Rockefeller then did, almost immediately, he said, we're going to take money from drivers and we're going to give it over to the transit system. And I supported that at the time. I thought it was a good idea. But we were taking money from the wrong people. These were not people coming into Manhattan who could avail themselves of the transit systems that we were supporting. So Nelson Rockefeller set this in place, and it's still in place today. And it's because of these three men that we pay or we don't pay tolls and how much we pay on different facilities. And what I'm about to show you is how this kind of inequity plays itself out. And essentially, it's the pogo possum line. We have met the enemy, and he is us. I spent, I'd say now, almost 46, 47 years working on some form of congestion pricing. Yes, I am pretty stubborn. Still working on it. And it really started for me with the Clean Air Act in 1970. It was the first time that mobile emissions were being included in clean air, and mobile emissions meant the automobile. And so cities had to achieve a certain level of attainment of air quality. And so New York City was found to be non-in-attainment, particularly carbon monoxide, particulates, nitrogen oxides, and others. And so New York City had to develop a plan called the State Implementation Plan, and the chapter I worked on was called the Transportation Control Plan. And it included tolls on the East and Harlem River bridges. It was approved by the mayor. It was submitted to the state of New York and was approved by the governor in 1973. Anybody guess who governor was? Harold, you're a historian. 1973? A rare governor. Malcolm Wilson, right. Approved by Malcolm Wilson and then sent to the federal government, and the federal government approved it. Done. Tolls on the East and Harlem River bridges done. Traffic solved. Let's move on to the next problem. Well, John Lindsay was not reelected mayor. Along came Abraham Beame, also from Brooklyn, kind of the Democratic clubhouse, and he did not support tolls on the East and Harlem River bridges. He stalled, and he stalled, and he stalled to the point that environmental groups and the federal government were getting annoyed that he wasn't implementing the plan. So a number of environmental groups, the Sierra Club, Friends of the Earth, and many others got together, 13 groups in all, and hired NRDC, or worked with NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, to sue the city in federal court. And they won the lawsuit. Some of the data that they got came from a lowly traffic engineer at the traffic department who gave it to a friend of his who worked at EPA, who gave it to another friend who used to work at EPA and worked at NRDC and fed it to the lawyers, Ross Sandler, David Schonbrun, who then sued the city, won the suit. It was upheld on appeal. And so now the city was under court order, federal court order, that it had to implement the tolls on the Eastern Harlem River bridges. There's nothing that could stop it. The city approved it, the state approved it, the feds approved it, the US courts systems approved it. Nothing could stop it except an act of Congress. That's ridiculous. How could there be an act of Congress for tolls on the Eastern Harlem River bridges? Well, in 1977, two of our most progressive elected officials, Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman, famous for being on the Judiciary Committee. I think she may have been chair when Richard Nixon was facing the committee. And Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan passed the Moynihan-Holtzman Amendment, or the Holtzman-Moynihan Amendment, that actually stopped the city or allowed the city to escape the clause to implement the tolls with something else. And that something else was the beginning of the funding plan for the MTA, but there the city no longer had to implement tolls. Abe Beame did not get reelected. Ed Koch got reelected, and suddenly that engineer who was feeding some information found himself in an administration that was kind of more open to more progressive ideas on transportation again. And I was made assistant commissioner in charge of planning for the City Department of Transportation, which was a surprise for me because I was never any part of the political scene, and that's where all the commissioners came from. And in 1980, after the transit strike, and I was the chief architect of the city's response to the transit strike. The city planned to how to manage the streets without any transit on it. And that's where the word gridlock came out of, the transit strike. I released it to the lexicon then. It caught on. But people said, let's implement a number of those things that you were doing during the transit strike. So we did bus lanes and bike lanes. And someday there's another session, we'll talk about the bike lanes of 1980 and where they went. But we also implemented or passed a regulation which would have implemented a form of congestion pricing aimed at the vehicles that contributed the most to pollution and space, taking up space, and those were the driver-only cars. So the plan was that driver-only cars would have to use a toll facility if they were entering Manhattan between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. So instead of using the 4, quote, free untolled bridges, they would have to use the Midtown Tunnel, the Battery Tunnel, or the Triborough Bridge to come into Manhattan. And if you were in a multi-occupant vehicle, which is what we did during the transit strike, it worked successfully, you were allowed to use any crossing that you wanted. Seemed fair. And we got the regulation passed, and we were on our way again. And what could stop us? Well, we were sued almost immediately by the Automobile Club of New York, which I expected, and then by the biggest practitioners of congestion pricing there are, the parking garage industry. If you look at how they set their rates, it's congestion pricing. So if you're in the center of Manhattan, if next month you want to visit the tree and park near Rockefeller Center, you will pay $90 for the pleasure for that day. But if you want to see a tree that is somewhere in Maspeth, you could park in a garage for $2 for that day. So they've been practicing congestion pricing for many, many decades. So in 1980, we were sued. The city lost the suit, found that we didn't have the authority, that it rested with the state, and that was the end of that. I tried to get Ed Koch again in '87 to think about congestion pricing, and 1,000 business people showed up at the steps of City Hall protesting the draconian measures that the city was contemplating. And you know about 2008, or at least most of you know about the Bloomberg plan and how he tried to implement congestion pricing. I was an advisor to Mike Bloomberg when he was a candidate, introduced him to the concept of congestion pricing, and when I introduced it back in 2001, he wasn't a big fan. But over the years, he became a big fan of congestion pricing, tried to implement it, and the state legislature didn't even hold a hearing. There are so many fingers that have been pointed that the Bloomberg people didn't bow to Shelley Silver and others, that the Republicans wouldn't have supported it, that he didn't have the votes, or whatever it was, it didn't get through. So it's important that we go back and we see what failed, what didn't work, what did we learn. So I spent a lot of time going around, and the things that I heard is no matter what you call it, people will call it a tax. It's a tax. We're not paying it today, we're going to have to pay it. The second was the sanctity of interborough travel. as if it's something sacred about going from Queens to the Bronx and therefore, or Brooklyn to Manhattan, and you shouldn't have to pay for it. Nobody seemed to trust that the dollars would go to transportation. And the car-centric outer communities said, you're asking for us to dig into our pocket and giving us nothing in return. And the fifth common one that I heard whenever I left Manhattan Island was that Manhattanites, and I lived in Brooklyn for 52 years, and eventually I moved to Manhattan. And so I remember the borough president of Brooklyn at the time, Marty Markowitz, who used to live around the corner from where I lived in Brooklyn, started to yell at me as a Manhattanite and threatened to take away my Brooklyn street creds, that I didn't deserve it anymore. And he said, you Manhattanites, during the course of your day, you would not be crossing an East River Bridge in a car, yet you're going to get most of the benefit. And I thought about that, and he was right. It was true. So I kept hearing this time and time again. So that's why I say let's learn from history, otherwise we're doomed to repeat it. George Santayana. So one of the things that I did is I looked at the vote that was held on the Bloomberg plan. And the vote was 30 councilmen for, 20 against. And if you looked at where the support was, you could see from this map, the green, that the support, everyone in Manhattan supported it, every council member. This was a vote the city council had, but the city council didn't have authority. It was really just a home rule message. The Bronx, everybody supported it. There was one abstention. In Brooklyn and Queens, wherever there was a bridge that would be charged under the Bloomberg plan, the council members supported it. Why? Because they knew that traffic would be reduced by those bridges. But the opposition was largely from the outer parts of Queens, the outer parts of Brooklyn, and the outer parts of Staten Island, or most of Staten Island. So that's where I spent about 5 years going to these communities and spending time with elected officials and hearing what they had to say. Meeting with people out in eastern Queens, what they would say to me, just look out our backyard. You see the Throgsneck Bridge, the Whitestone Bridge. We're paying through the nose on these bridges, and you keep raising the tolls on these bridges, and you're giving us nothing. You're taking most of this money, and in this case, over $700 million a year to get directly from Queens to the Bronx, or Bronx to Queens. There's no other direct path to do it. You're taking over $700 million, you're taking the majority of that money, and you're giving it to transit. You're taking that money out of our pockets, and we get no transit. There's no decent transit for us as an alternative. How can you call that fair? And now you want us to pay more when we go into Manhattan. Forget about it, they said. And you could see, since I started doing this, tolls went from $11 to $17 cash, and from $9.14 to $11.52 Easy Pass, just since December of 2010. Now this is unfair. I talked about how the Martians would view this as the hottest place on earth. When I went out to Staten Island, they said, you're killing us. Every way you try to get into Staten Island, whether it's from New Jersey or from Brooklyn, you have to pay a toll. And yes, thank you, Governor. The governor gave us a bit of a discount so that we residents don't have to pay the full fare on it. But we, those of us in the businesses, we can't recruit talent from just a couple of miles away in Bay Ridge. Because some young person that's coming over the bridge that we want to work for us is going to have to pay now $17 cash or $11.52 Easy Pass to come across that bridge. And so you don't get the talent. The cost of trucking in Staten Island is sky high because of that. And then we have among one of the craziest systems here, and this doesn't occur anywhere on Earth. Now, I've said this in many places, and no one's challenged me, so I assume I'm right, but I didn't check every place on Earth. But we have 3 crossings We have 2 with a toll, sandwiching one that's free. It's like enticing. You know, it's free. Come on over here, buddy. You and that big, Suburban over there. Come here. We're free over here on it. So what happens every single day? I studied the traffic at the Queensboro Bridge, which goes back to when I started at the traffic department. It was at the foot of the Queensboro Bridge in Long Island City. I see an old colleague here that remembers 2811 Bridge Plaza North is what we called it back then, the old Pan Am building. Well, I watched the traffic over the years. I was in charge of research, and I watched as the tolls went up, fewer and fewer people were using the 2 toll crossings and more vehicles were using the Queensboro Bridge. So today, 40,000 cars, trucks, taxis flood Long Island City, Astoria, and Sunnyside to avoid the tolls. And they end up on the east side of Manhattan. So those 2 communities, the east side of Manhattan near the Queensboro Bridge and the Sunnyside, Long Island City area are the ones that suffer the most because of this. The traffic hops off the Long Island Expressway, the Grand Central Parkway, the BQE, and they use city streets. So instead of staying on highways, they use city streets. On highways, they don't encounter pedestrians. On highways, they're usually not driving by anyone's living room where people are breathing those fumes. Well, when they leave those highways, they're on very busy streets. They're on busy streets where pedestrians are. They're on busy streets where there are developments and houses, and people live and work on those streets. And it adds millions of vehicle miles every year, adding noise and air pollution, and pedestrian and car crashes soar. Here's a study that was done by Quant New York looking at a heat map of where fatalities and serious casualties occur. No surprise, at the foot of the Ed Koch Bridge, both sides. If you live anywhere near 59th Street and 2nd Avenue, anywhere within a half mile of there, you're at greater risk because 40,000 more vehicles are traveling in your community. Right here, we're at greater risk. We're within that distance of that. Same thing in Long Island City, same thing in Sunnyside, that we do this ridiculous plan. Now, our plan makes absolutely no sense when we take a look at how we charge people. Robert Moses built the bridges and the crossings that have the dollar signs that you see. And he also believed in service for his customers. So he built 100-mile-long highways leading up to these crossings. So at the Triborough Bridge, you can go all the way out the Grand Central to the Northern State for almost 100 miles. On the Midtown Tunnel, Long Island Expressway, all the way out to Riverhead, 100 miles. The Battery Tunnel, you could go take the belt system into the Southern State for about 100 miles. So for about 100 miles or anywhere in the suburbs or in the city, you could travel on a highway, head towards Manhattan, and then as you get close to Manhattan, we say, wait, we're going to charge you to go that last mile. We prefer you to use city streets. Don't stay on highways. So this is the crazy system that we have, putting traffic on city streets, and that increases congestion, casualties, pollution. And this one's just plain dumb. We charge people to go from Queens to Queens across the Cross Bay Bridge, but not to go from Queens to the Central Business District, to go to Midtown Manhattan across the Ed Koch Bridge. This is kind of the craziest of all. If you're in Brooklyn and you're at, let's say, the Barclays Center, which is kind of where the 2 roads cross Atlantic Avenue, you could see an X under the letter Y there, where the letter Y is. And that's about the Barclays Center. But if you're anywhere along there, that's Flatbush and Atlantic Avenue, and you're heading towards Newark Airport, you've got a choice. You could take the highways, the Gowanus into the Verrazano Bridge, into the Staten Island Expressway to Goethals Bridge, if you're heading to Newark Airport. And a lot of trucks are heading to Newark Airport. And if you do that, you will be charged $96. But if you're a trucker who decides that I'd rather take the scenic route over the 108-year-old cracking Manhattan Bridge, and it is cracking, that's another story for you, and bounce along the streets of Canal and Chinatown and Little Italy and Soho and go out the Holland Tunnel, and the bigger trucks go out the Lincoln Tunnel, it will be free. The bigger you are, the more money you save by driving through Manhattan. It's wonderful. That's what we say. We want you to drive on our streets. If you're a 5-axle truck like that, you're saving almost $100 by not taking highways and using city streets. Now, some people have been paying more, not the people on the East River bridges. We, those of us who've used the toll crossings, have seen 8 toll increases since 2000 on the toll crossings. Throgs Neck, the Whitestone, Verrazano, and others. If you take the subway, you've seen 6 fare increases since 2000. If you take the Queensboro Bridge or any of the untolled bridges, still 0 since 1911. Something wrong with that picture where some people are asked to pay more and more and more, and some people are asked not to pay another cent. Someone is subsidizing someone, and it's people on the subways, people who are taking the Throgs Neck and the Whitestone Bridge and the Verrazano that are subsidizing the drivers going across the untolled bridges. So here's the current dysfunctional pricing scheme, and you could see the different rates in the free bridges. And so what I propose is, let's start all over again. And if we started all over again, and I assume this is a group of smart people in the room here, and we're going to come up with a tolling scheme because we know we have to raise some revenue from cars to pay for transit going into Manhattan, heavy rail transit. Would we say, hey, a smart thing would be to charge those people in the northeast quadrant on the Throgs Neck Bridge? Let's charge those people. That wouldn't make any sense. Or let's charge the people in the Rockaways. That wouldn't make sense. Let's charge the people on the Verrazano Bridge. It wouldn't make sense. So what makes sense? Well, let me go back to William Vickery, who conceived congestion pricing, and essentially he said you should do it where you have serious congestion and offer people an alternative, good transit. So you have in the Move New York plan, we have higher tolls where you have serious congestion and you have good transit, and we lower the tolls everywhere else. What does that look like? Well, the green shows you the lowered tolls. So on the Triborough Bridge, the Whitestone, the Throgs Neck Bridge, $2.50 off each way or $5 off round trip. The Verrazano Bridge, $5 off. It's collected one way. $2 off round trip, any of the other bridges. The Henry Hudson, the Cross Bay, the Gil Hodges Bridge. In the Bronx, all 4 bridges that have tolls get slashed. In Queens, 5 bridges have their tolls slashed. 1 bridge has tolls returned, the Queensboro Bridge, on that. Yet that's where we have perhaps the most opposition, where we're removing tolls from 5 bridges. We remove tolls on every bridge within the city of New York. No, we don't remove. We slash tolls on every bridge in the city of New York that's within the city of New York. And we maintain the same prices that we have at the Midtown Tunnel, the Battery Tunnel, to end this bridge shopping, where people shop for the cheapest bridge, so that the Manhattan, the Brooklyn, Williamsburg, and Queensboro Bridge are all now $5.76 each way to come into the Central Business District. So no longer do you avoid avoid the Midtown Tunnel and go through Long Island City, or avoid the Midtown Tunnel and go through East Midtown, and the same thing going up the Upper East Side on that. Same thing coming down at 60th Street. If you're driving into the Central Business District and you're coming down Lexington Avenue or 2nd Avenue, you will pay a charge as well. The Queensboro Bridge has a little quirk there in that the upper roadway doesn't go into the Central Business District, so that would be a lower charge, the same charge as the Triborough Bridge would have, or the Whitestone and the others. So this makes more sense because the people are being charged that have the alternative of transit. Think about the people driving on the Manhattan Bridge. There are 4 tracks on the Manhattan Bridge. There are no tracks on any of the other bridges that we're charging the tolls on. But dealing with that Marty Markowitz and his complaint about Manhattanites getting the benefits and not paying. Well, how do Manhattanites contribute to congestion? Not when they're in the subway, not when they're on their buses. So we looked at that and we decided that there were 3 additional charges. One is a surcharge on taxis, which would be based on distance and on time. Same thing for the Ubers, the Lyfts, the for-hire vehicles, and this would be south of 96th Street. And then there's the quirk where Manhattanites get a parking tax rebate. If they have monthly parking, they will pay about 8 or 9% less than someone from Brooklyn or Queens that comes in and wants to use that same garage on a monthly basis. It's just a quirk from maybe a day when there were low-income people that were using parking garages in some of these areas. So we end the parking tax rebate on that. And the bottom line is 1.5 billion net revenue per year, net, because we removed about 600 million in tolls from the other bridges, so we really collect over 2.2 billion, but we've lowered some tolls. If we wanted to bond that money, there's about a 15-to-1 ratio on that. It could be $15 to $22 billion infusion almost pretty quickly. It translates into 30,000 local jobs because you can't farm out infrastructure work to some other place. It has to take place in the city you're working in, and a reduction in travel time about 20%. And distributing the revenue, we did something different here also. Again, listening to the AAA that sued me in 1980, listening to many of the drivers, elected officials, who said some of the money has to go back to the drivers. So we have 25% goes for roads and bridges, 3/4 goes for transit. So it's a balancing act, and roads and bridges do need it also. So the difference between the Move New York plan and the Bloomberg plan, tolls are slashed on every MTA bridge, 38 to 46%. Bloomberg, no tolls were reduced. East River Bridges and 60th Street charged, same. 1.5 billion in revenue versus 500 million in revenue. Part of the difference is that Bloomberg was not 7 days a week. We proposed 7 days a week. 375 million for roads and bridges. There was nothing for roads and bridges. 1.125 billion for transit versus 500 million for transit. Taxis and Uber didn't exist in Bloomberg when Bloomberg proposed. So we have a charge by distance and time. Speeds jump by 20% versus 9%. And Manhattanites become the biggest contributors because of the additional charges that through taxis, through the black cars, through the parking tax rebate. And Brooklyn and Queens were the biggest contributors under the Bloomberg plan. So this was a bit of a balancing act, but I think it was good planning. Citywide benefits, 1.5 billion per year. You can go on the website for Move New York. You could see the kinds of things that have been proposed for each borough. There is a long list of them. I'm not going to get into the details here. And this is a summary. Again, you can go to the Move New York site. There's a lot to read here, but I've already covered most of it. So the 5 issues that I talked about earlier, how do you deal with it not being a tax? Well, we're not going to get away with it by calling it tolls. I try user fees. People will still use the T word on it. But it's fair pricing where there's congestion and good transit, so Manhattan CBD only. As far as breaking up the city, it's actually less expensive to travel between the boroughs under the Move New York plan. So we think that we addressed that pretty well. Manhattanites paying the least or paying less than Brooklyn and Queens, they end up paying the most. The dollars must go to transportation. That has to be in the legislation, or the money has to be bonded. The fact that cost-centric outer communities complain that they got nothing, here many of their tolls will be reduced, and $375 million annually for roads and bridges. We've received every single major publication supports the Move New York plan. From the right, the New York Post, Fox supports it, New York Times, Daily News, Newsday, Staten Island Advance, and others. We have widespread support. When we do public opinion polling, if you say, would you like to pay pay tolls on East River bridges or a millionaire's tax wins. People want to charge the millionaires. But if you explain the Move New York plan in detail to people, people do then support the Move New York plan, whether they're from Brooklyn, Queens, or any borough. And you could see 54% of New York City voters support Move New York versus other funding alternatives. And then global strategy into 2014, when the plan was explained, 62% were in favor. Lots of civic groups are supporting, and we hope there are more supports here. So what are the alternatives? And so people have been kicking around that, well, we've got to raise a lot of money for transit. They're not necessarily thinking about the congestion problem, although of late they're now thinking of the congestion problem. You can increase the gas tax, the sales tax, the payroll mobility tax, or issue even more debt, which we're already close to our limit with debt, or we can let the system slip back to the future. Charlie Kamenoff has done this analysis on how much it would cost on the gasoline tax. It would be a 52-cent hike to achieve $1.5 billion. Auto registration fee that's been suggested, $800. And you could see some of these others. None of them are really gaining any momentum or are being discussed, such as wherever we go, restore the commuter tax, raise the payroll mobility tax. I can tell you there is not an appetite in Albany for any of these. Now, just a quickie, why is traffic so bad? This was a study done by Bruce Schaller. It is once we introduced Uber, Lyft, Via, Get, Juno, and all the others that are coming our way, and there are more coming our way, they all congregated in the same areas. The areas of Manhattan and the waterfronts of Brooklyn and Queens. The areas that already have the best transit, already have the worst traffic, and have the wealthiest citizens. So it was a triple whammy when we got introduced for the TNCs, the transportation network companies, the Uber, Lyfts. The mayor was right 4 or 5 years ago when he said, let's put a 1% cap on it, but then he caved because of the unbelievable scorched earth lobbying by Uber, and that's Uber's lobbyist that said we used the scorched earth approach, and I could tell you I felt some of that heat on that. And where did they go? They came out of the subways when they went into Uber and Lyft and others. They came out of buses. Buses are really suffering. And we've seen a growth in bikes and ferries in the past year. I also got the equity issue. What about that poor person who is driving into the central business district? Now, I don't know where that low-income person can park. That's going to be pretty difficult to find inexpensive parking. But we looked at a couple of things. This was done by the Tri-State Transportation Campaign, looked at the delta in incomes between car owners and non-car owners. Citywide, it's $85,000 versus car owners, who in transportation terms, we call them choice riders. They have the choice. They can take transit or they could take their car, versus transit captives, which are the low-income people. They don't own a car to a large extent. And you could look at the delta everywhere. In Queens, where we have the most opposition, it's $85,000 for people who own cars versus $42,000 without cars. Let's say somebody had to pay every single day, look at the note at the bottom, had to pay the toll every single workday, 250 days a year. That would amount to $2,880. Add that to any of these and you could see it doesn't make up much of the difference. You know, if you lower the income from $85,000 to $82,000 versus $40,000, or $134,000 going to $131,000, or any of these. People talk about what a hardship it is. Community Service Society put together this wonderful graph If you look at the bottom, the working poor who would potentially pay congestion tolls, one person versus 38 people that would be better off from the working poor, from lower income people. So on the equity issues, Move New York comes out way ahead on that. And I'd like to close with this. This was a New Yorker cartoon. Two dogs talking. I would not be opposed to a cat tax, and this is what I hear all the time wherever I go: tax someone else. You know, I would not be opposed to a Verrazano Bridge toll hike or a Whitestone Bridge toll hike. Just to be fair, all subway riders, drivers should contribute, not just cats. Thank you very much. Do we want to take a few questions? Yes. We have a microphone going around, so please.
Hi, how do you propose to keep the area within Lower Manhattan from being sort of a walled garden where the Ubers just circle and circle around 24 hours a day and more Ubers just flow in and never flow out?
Okay, when it comes to Ubers and Lyfts and the others, we don't charge them the cordon charge. So it's not that ring. We charge them when they're within the district. So they will pay every single time they're moving, and I'd like to even charge them when they're parked in the area. So they...
So even when they're not even, when they don't even have a fare, they would be charged?
Well, we're looking at cruising, but right now it's when the Move New York plan is when they have a fare. And you know what? Uber, Lyft, Via, the yellow taxis are supporting a pricing charge now. First of all, Uber practices it with surge pricing themselves. And secondly, they are dying in the traffic congestion. 50 years ago, I drove a yellow cab. I can tell you, you do not want to spend the afternoon with your passenger. You don't make any money if you're moving crosstown at 3-4 miles an hour. Okay. Yes. Yes.
I just want to clarify something. This congestion parking is not 24 hours a day, is it?
Well, under the Move New York plan, it's 24 hours a day, but it varies by time of day. So it's higher during the daytime, during the peak hours, and it gets lower during the off-peak hours.
I'm thinking of people from the boroughs who come into the city on the weekend or the evening for entertainment. Would they have to pay?
Yeah, the people from the boroughs that come in by subway have to pay, and the people that come in from New Jersey, from Hoboken, have to pay, and I don't see any reason people driving in on weekends from Brooklyn or Queens or Long Island should not pay when everybody else has to pay. And have you seen weekend traffic congestion in Manhattan? It's pretty bad on that. Somebody way in the back, green sweater over there?
I wonder what you think about bike lanes. I mean, it's really good to have more people riding bikes, but for some streets like Columbus Avenue, they've lost a traffic lane to make a bike lane, and so that it's more congested for the cars because the bike lane is there. It's replacing a driving lane with a bike lane. I wonder what you think about that and how this all might be accommodated.
Okay, if you, my book is for sale upstairs, and I go back to the 1880s and 1890s when it was the bike riders that were traveling the roads and called for hard roads and decided to align themselves with these motor vehicle groups, and they got the hard roads and the motor vehicle groups kicked them off the road. So I welcome bike riders coming back and using the roadways in big numbers. I think it's actually quite helpful. I do have a problem with some of the designs that the city has tried to accommodate everybody, so we have a lot of congestion. They allow too much of parking when commercial vehicles are really trying to get closer to the curb. So if you go First Avenue, Columbus Avenue, Second Avenue, you will see trucks double parked on both sides, and you'll see 1 or 2 lanes left open. That's a design mistake. I like the bike lanes. I wouldn't blame them. I would say it's really the mistake of the designers on it. Maybe 3 questions more, because I know we wanted to wrap up. This gentleman over here.
I'm from Brooklyn, and
All right.
I spoke with Shelley Silver about congestion pricing, opposed to it, but I'm starting to change my mind.
Okay.
But the question is, why has not the Aldamato one-way toll on the Verrazano Bridge been repealed since he's no longer in the Senate?
Okay, well, he did get it passed in the Senate, but it was really Guy Molinari from Staten Island. He was a congressman, and he's the one that pushed it. Yeah, it's ridiculous. We kind of stayed away from it, but even on the panel is James Molinaro from Staten Island. And I don't want to tell too many stories that what goes on in the governor's panel, but yeah, there wasn't opposition coming from him at all now that we have electronic charging and the removal of stopping. So there is no reason for it. And I really hope that one of the outcomes is a return to 2-way tolls so you don't have that kind of inequality that I showed you in one of those slides. Okay, 2 more questions. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Can you give us a suggestion as to what we can do to support this congestion pricing?
Sure.
When we had the last election, I inquired from the council people that were up for election, and many of their volunteers didn't even know what side their council candidate was on. Thank you.
So what I'd like you to focus on are state officials. So council members, I think we would get the majority again if we had a council vote, and the state may ask for a home rule message, which they often do in something like this. But contact your assembly member, your senator. Try to reach out to them and try to get them to support it. Write to the governor. The governor's going to need support. If the governor comes out, and I think the governor is going to be pretty courageous coming out on this. I'm not going to upstage the governor, and I really don't know if he is going to come out with this, but if he does, it'll probably be part of the State of the State message and part of his budget coming out in the spring. He's going to need support. He's going to need people writing letters to editors because many other people will be writing. He'll need you to write to other elected officials and make sure that they support the plan, people in the Assembly and the Senate. So public opinion is really very important. Let's take a last question. A student right over here.
So subways are somewhat at capacity right now, and with congestion pricing, there would be people who right now commute on cars that would be going on the subway. And I know that congestion pricing would increase MTA funding, but for that funding to kick in, it would take a couple of years for the MTA to actually make the improvements. So I guess, are you concerned with the subways being able to have everybody have the increased ridership? And also for congestion pricing to work, would there be new subway lines that would need to be expanded?
Okay, so a couple of years ago, you saw that we were running at 90% on time or close to it with the subway system, and now we're down to 68%. So am I concerned about any new riders? Yes, if it's 68%, if we're not going to improve that. But I believe we are going to improve it. The governor has committed a certain chunk of money. I'm hoping that the mayor contributes a certain chunk of money. And the MTA now has engaged in a program to speed up repair of its signals and tracks and other things. They're going to have to do that. It'll take 2 years to implement something like this. So during that period, what London did was they bought 500 buses and they ran extra buses from day one. There will have to be a day one strategy before this goes into effect. And it's one of the things that is being discussed right now at the panel is a day one strategy, how to raise money for that day one strategy. Now, if you get the legislation passed, you could sell the bonds even if the money isn't being collected for years in the future. So you can see some of that through capital improvements. Now, the other part of that is the numbers aren't as great as people think. When congestion pricing has been implemented anywhere, Stockholm or London or any other city, 85% of the drivers did what they previously did. They drove in. It was 15%, and we're estimating about the same thing here. So of that 15%, there's some percentage that will no longer go right through Manhattan, and they will drive around. So that 15% gets smaller than that. And then it gets spread over various time periods and over various subway lines. We have to increase the capacity on our subway lines. We have to do better with enforcement of our bus lanes, and we're talking about that. It's one of the things to improve capacity. But we can't go forward if we are accepting an on-time performance of 68%. So we really have to change that. Was there a second part to your question, or was that it? Well, the Second Avenue subway line is one that is being built up to Harlem, or it's being designed right now. I'd like to see a few other rail lines built. I'd like to see some streetcar lines, light rail on 42nd Street. I'd like to see the Brooklyn-Queens streetcar. Later this week, the Regional Plan Association, which I'm a board member of, is going to release a plan for a number of transit improvements, including the Triborough RX, which uses existing rail lines going from Brooklyn to Queens to the Bronx. So what I'm talking about right now is bringing the system back up to 95% on time. That's got to be the first focus while we find other money for some of these other projects going forward. So, okay, last question, because there's somebody very eager over here. Yes? Wait for the mic. Okay.
You mentioned earlier, the woman back there talked about the bike lanes, and you mentioned then when you were answering her something about double parking. Did anybody think about the tremendous revenues in either towing or ticketing the double parked cars, which create incredible congestion?
Well, for many years, I was the guy that was ticketing and towing them. So I hope, chances are, the high probability here, I towed somebody in this room. So I don't like to mention that. But first of all, on towing, the rules are you can't make money on towing. It has to be a fee. On parking tickets, yes, the city makes about $500 million, but the city's approach is kind of backwards. They will write tickets and tow cars where it's easy to write tickets and it's easy to tow cars, and that's not the heart of Midtown Manhattan where people are watching their vehicles. I would travel around with tow trucks behind me. I don't know, did anybody here ever go on one of those blitzes with me? People it would seem they'd jump out a window to land in their car and move that car. It's a hard place. You need to approach it scientifically. There is money there, but that's not the right approach. You should eliminate the parking, the double parking. And truckers do not want to double park. You've got to free that curbside up so that they can get against the curb and not double park. They're not the villains here. Thank you very much.
So please join us upstairs where we can question Sam further. There will be no tolls on the elevator and stairs.